And I know that you were in Ethiopia and then you left from Ethiopia to go to Eritrea. And I know because I was worried about both of you and all of you that when you were there, you were not able to use the kinds of communication services that are mostly available, especially in the Western world. But everything was fine. You know, you were having a decent experience and trip. So I know you made the point, so I'll let you fold this into whatever you say that uh, there's a way in which Western countries intentionally keep Eritrea underdeveloped, and that you could speak to that in discussing what you saw on the ground when you went into Eritrea.
No, well, I really appreciate that. And I think that it's a really crucially important point to understand about Eritrea. I mean, it's obvious, you Google it and, you see the worst possible things, the, quote unquote, North Korea of Africa, which, says a lot about how North Korea is viewed in the West too. But all these other various sort of slanderous different informations designed to make you think it's the worst of the worst, the deepest, darkest black hole that ever exists, which heavily shapes people's understanding to the extent they even follow it. Because like many topics on the African continent, people don't really know it. But I think the point of I think Eritrea is similar to many countries in the developing world, faces sort of like the basic structural realities of all countries in the developing world, which is that basically the entire global economy is structured towards servicing the needs of the global north. Now, of course, the growth of China has slightly shifted that, but not significantly, and especially for Africa, given the relationship between primary commodity production and consumption. But that being said, I think a lot of those structural challenges are consistent across all developing countries, the lack of real access to capital, the challenges even developing industries in the context of a global environment that when you do have access to capital discourages it, right? So if you're a poor country, you need money, it's hard to get money. The easiest places to get money, it's like the IMF and the World Bank. But then they say, if you take our money, you have to do these things that make you more dependent on the West. And really, honestly, Eritrea is a young country, just formed in 1991 after a long liberation struggle, has had quite a bit of challenges in terms of sanctions, in terms of isolation. I know one of the things that you have reported on quite a bit and better than many other people, Kevin, is Julian Assange and the work of WikiLeaks. Well, you can read in WikiLeaks in relationship to how the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government is addressing Eritrea that really their policy, starting in a major way in 2007 to 2009 and continuing until today, though it wasn't all sweetness and light before that, has been to do what they can to isolate the country. I mean, there's a State Department cable that WikiLeaks did reveal. And, thanks you also, of course, to Chelsea Manning for making it possible for a lot of these diplomatic cables to be at WikiLeaks. But it reveals that the U.S. was going around the world to any country that was providing aid to Eritrea that was significant. And they were trying to do whatever they could and put pressure on them to cut the ability to cut the aid, to try to isolate them explicitly. That's their goal. And you can find many different conversations between U.S. officials and Ethiopian government officials, between U.S. officials and EU officials, between U.S. officials and themselves, essentially trying to promote sanctions and trying to promote isolation of Eritrea, principally because they were doing things that went against the U.S. writ in their broader region. They were unwilling to participate in the destabilization of Somalia, which was a major U.S. goal. They were unwilling to participate in the cordon sanitaire that was being placed around Iran, and were willing to deal with Iran and have relations with them. They were sanctioned by the United States for trading with North Korea. You see it all over the WikiLeaks that the U.S. is complaining. Well, they're talking to Cuba, they're talking to Venezuela, all these countries that are, against the United States. They were labeled anti-Western. So there are a number of different development challenges that I think they would have anyway, and that almost all similar countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, already have, which is, of course, rooted in the history of colonialism and the contemporary reality of imperialism. But they also have been able to, they also have had to face a significant campaign of demonization, of isolation, and of sanctions, which have heavily stunted what they're doing. So there's more I can say about what we saw on the ground, but I think that context is really important to understand so many of the slanders and misconceptions and distortions that are put out there about Eritrea.
And then, Rania, what did you take away from being on the ground in Eritrea? I'll just be very, very broad and indefinite in my question.
Eritrea is this like place that no one really knows that much about because of the fact that there is such an attempt to like have a blackout on it. And the only things that are available, if you read about Eritrea, is like it's a bad place. It's so terrible. Everybody there is miserable. Everybody wants to leave. Like if you go to YouTube and you put in Eritrea, one of the first things that'll come up is this Vice report that that is called like something like Eritrea, the North Korea of Africa. Um,
Oh God.
and yeah, and I know, and Eugene has a good comment in response to that framing, but and I'll let him get to that in a moment. But it's just Eritrea was really interesting because on top of everything Eugene just said, to see it on the ground, it was actually really inspiring to see the ways that they've tried to mitigate the worst impacts of being so isolated by US sanctions. Um, they have a really interesting development model that has a lot of socialist aspects to it, particularly with like the medical system, also with education. That is kind of like has a lot of parallels to Cuba, in fact, but you don't ever hear about that side of Eritrea. And they also are like really proud of their liberation struggle, and they're also politicized because of their liberation struggle. And that like informs how they function as a country. Everything is about self-sufficiency. Everything is about basically not being like a lot of other African countries that are kind of like just these capitalist states that are completely dependent on outside aid, that are run by like US aligned oligarchs. And where the vast majority of the country is like living in poverty, while there's like a handful of elites that have all the money and resources that are aligned with like Western transnational companies. And Eritrea doesn't want to be that way. And I think that's another reason why they're so punished. And they really go out of their way in terms of their policies to make sure that they don't have to rely on the outside. So we got to see a lot of interesting things on the ground, like what they're doing with farming, for example. And they invest a lot of money in like building dams and building infrastructure in rural areas, so where people can like grow food and their kids can also still go to school. And like we actually visited these dams and farms, and like that was really cool. And also, I don't know, I mean, it it was like Eritrea. The other thing that was interesting about it, it was a super safe place. I think it's like the safest. It might be, if I'm not mistaken, might be like the safest country in Africa or something. Um, so it was like the kind of place where you can like walk around in the middle of the night and be totally fine. It's the kind of place where like you could probably drop your wallet and someone will find their way to give it back to you. Uh, I mean, if you think about like American cities, that's not exactly that like something you can expect to happen if you drop your wallet. So that was also really interesting too, to like see the level of safety there, and kind of like the health of society is just much different than a lot of the places that are aligned with the United States. And I think you